me. I appreciate it, and welcome everyone. I appreciate everyone joining today for our session, our second in a four-part internal audit compliance webinar series that we've been doing now for several years. Today's session is going to be around cybersecurity and on IT audit, how better to protect your data. Just a quick background on today's presenter. First of all, my name is Scott Sissel. I'm a partner in the Minneapolis office. I focus in healthcare. Got 30 plus years of experience. I actually have two, wear a couple different hats. I head up the health system segment of our industry practice. Healthcare is our firm's largest industry practice. And I also lead the firm's internal audit services group, which is part of risk advisory services and includes a variety of services, including IT audit. Kyle Hendrickson is joining us. Kyle is the director of our cybersecurity services based in Fargo, North Dakota. And David Rowan, who's a senior manager in our risk advisory services. David has spent many years in the IT audit and risk assessment arena, as well as working in a variety of different firms and organizations in his career. So both of them will talk a little bit more about themselves and their area of expertise as we move into it. Just as I mentioned earlier, today is the second in a four-part series around cybersecurity and audit. For those of you that are interested, November 16th, we're going to have a session on data analytics using computing power to ensure compliance in the revenue cycle. So a bit of a revenue cycle focus, which I know many people in the healthcare arena are certainly focused in on optimizing revenue. And then we'll wrap it up. The fourth session is going to be really focused on compliance, talking about what has been high on the agenda, OIG and other organizations, and also planning for the future. And so again, for all of you, there's a website link in the attached presentation that you can go to if you want to sign on to any of these. Again, free CPE. As I mentioned, topic today is cyber and IT audit. A couple things we're going to talk about with respect to IT audit, current considerations. I believe in today's attendee list, there's not only compliance and internal audit people, but I think there's operational folks as well. And I think what you'll get out of this is some of those, a little background on what's happening in this area today, along with some key things that should be considered. We're also going to talk a little bit about HiTrust and how that can be of value to your organization. Just a quick, maybe one slide before we turn it over to David on the industry state. I think over the last 2-3 years, particularly the last 6 years, there's been 6 months, there's been a significant amount of changes within healthcare. Certainly the pandemic accelerated change, accelerated the use of digital, accelerated the use of remote working, both from the standpoint of providing care, but also some of the administrative functions as well. We're also kind of in an environment now where resources are scarce, and that's putting constraints on organizations and continuing operating pressures due to the cost increases. All those type of things certainly can increase risk, particularly as it relates to the topic of today. While we all like to think everyone is working remotely in a very secure environment, we probably know that there are some people that may take a shortcut, work at a coffee shop, or accessing things while they're working. And so that all increases risk within an organization. Certainly the cost pressures and the resource demands also create some risk that people are running harder to get their job done, and certainly increases the exposure to certainly some things happening that you hope wouldn't happen. And I think finally our political environment, or what's happening internationally now, raises the risk in this particular area, given the conflicts that are happening in Eastern Europe and Russia right now. And so all that seems to increase risk in this particular area. And our speakers today will talk a little bit more about what they're seeing, along with some of the opportunities to improve your control environment. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to David Rowan. I think he's going to start talking a little bit about some of these risks and go from there. So David, you want to take it over?
You bet. Thank you, Scott. A little bit about myself. My name's David Rowan. As Scott mentioned, I'm a senior manager within our risk advisory services. My background spans a wide variety of industries, have spent plenty of time in the healthcare arena, done a lot of internal audits, some external audit, and for the last 6 to 8 years, been primarily focused on the areas of kind of IT audit and IT compliance, heavily involved in our practices, SOC 1 and SOC 2 compliance related initiatives, as well as a HiTrust initiative as well. So again, happy to walk through these things, and we'll go ahead and start out with some of the top priorities for the United States Department of Defense. If you think about the things that are on the radar for the Fed, terrorism, trans-organizational crime, the top of the list is cyber threats. So not only is this a topic that is very relevant to specific industries, this is also heavily on the Department of Defenses as well. So it's definitely up there. As Scott said, the risks are out there, and it's something that we all should be taking care of, taking a look at. All right, cyber risk is business risk. That's definitely something that is honed into to us as a team within our group, because technology and IT information technology is the basis of most of what we do these days. So it's further on through the presentation, you'll see some information about how are we looking at risk as an organization, how does information promulgate throughout our applications and our environment, and then what are the things that we can do to potentially help mitigate some of those risks. A few statistics. I think this is one of Kyle's slides. If you want to go ahead and reach out on some of this, Bud.
Yeah, so just to jump in, one of the key telling statistics on this from the 2021 study from the Ponam Institute was healthcare and education are some of the most attractive targets for cyber attacks. Along with this, just to talk a little bit about the average 286 days to identify and contain a data breach. That's very telling as far as a statistic. And so with the number of people that have joined us today for this call, statistically speaking, some of the people that are listening today are actually in the midst of a cyber incident and they don't know it currently, or maybe you do, but this is a very worrying statistic. Also, cyber attacks, again, this is from 2021, but we also have the 2022 data that says they continue to increase. Cyber attackers are looking at how do they monetize their efforts? How do they extract payment, whether in the form of ransomware, extortion, or through selling personal data? They're all looking at how do they monetize their attacks.
Yeah, as Kyle mentioned, one of the biggest risks that we're seeing out there is related to malware. These actors aren't really the most highly technical people. There is software out there within the dark web that will basically allow you to have ransomware as a service. You get a bunch of data from an internet, and it'll give you people's email addresses. You can send out specific links to them, and then curate the different attacks that you've actually implemented. So this is definitely one of the top things on our radars, and it's one of those things that is somewhat fairly easy to mitigate. But again, it's one of the easiest ways for a company to be attacked, and we see definite instances of companies being completely compromised. DDoS attacks, again, they're typically we're seeing more of those with more integrated items. You've got different integrated Internet of Things cameras and things throughout specific homes as we start to move out of the workplace and into our homes and working from home. Data leakage, third-party and cloud vendor risks is another huge one. I think we'll have a potential discussion around one of the potential client that, or not a client, but at least a company where their vendor potentially copied some data. That data was eventually compromised and linked to the web. So definitely you got to be aware of our third parties and our cloud applications. Mobile web, again, we've all shifted our workplaces from in the office to in our homes, and as we migrate to these types of things, we need to make sure that we're taking care of mobile applications, who has access to what, and where is the weaknesses within our internal control. Cal, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to go ahead and talk on this?
Yeah, I can jump in here. So just to talk about some of the latest breaches, and Scott kind of caught me off guard here. He also said the last 30 days, just a little bit ago, from health systems, there was 8 health systems in addition to these 2 that were compromised, and this is just what we know publicly in the last 30 days. So ransomware, data breaches, this is real, and this is affecting our communities. This is affecting our ability to serve those who need healthcare around us. And so of the 8 additional that were sent to me, 5 of the 8 were ransomware. 1 of the 2 up here is ransomware. Ransomware is a huge deal, above and beyond the regular data breach type situation that we've all been hopefully preparing for and putting controls in place to protect against as we've worked to improve our IT systems and our cybersecurity posture over the past number of years.
Excellent. Yeah, as Kyle said, these are 2 of the larger ones that were identified. As everyone is aware, Common Spirit Health is a very large nonprofit health system. Delayed surgeries, disrupted patient care, left millions of patients waiting to see if their PII was compromised. Shields Healthcare Group was another very large one. 2 million individuals and their data was compromised. And the attackers were in their information systems for well over 2 weeks, just curating this data, and they took them well over 2 weeks to get them out and identify that they were there and shut them out. So again, it's, as Kyle said that earlier, typical attacks last well over 250, potentially 200, 300 days. On average, this one was shut down fairly quick, but they can get in and have that data within a short amount of time.
So jumping in, this is affecting us in the US disproportionately more than the rest of the world. When we look at reported ransomware incidents across worldwide and looking at a cross-section of countries, 44% of all of the reported ransomware incidents worldwide directly hit home in the United States. And why is that? Oh, we are a target. We are a first world nation. We have businesses that the world, not just the United States, rely on. We're in a position where we are directly in the sights of adversaries looking to cash out, looking to make some money off the back of the United States. So we are squarely in the focus when we're talking about healthcare institutions within the United States. And when we start looking at the business impact to ransomware, the average ransom demand was just short of $250,000. How does that impact your ability to serve your community as a healthcare institution? This is unplanned. This is at the drop of a hat. And does this prevent you from being able to provide other services? Does this disrupt your entire year or cash flow situation? Does this interrupt your ability to actually continue on as a business? 22 days, the average downtime. And I read recently that this has decreased to 21 days as of fourth quarter of 2021. So when we start talking about 3 weeks of not having access to IT services within your organization, what does that mean for your organization? How do you serve clients? How do you provide healthcare when you don't have access to electronic medical records? How do you make sure that you can continue on with something like payroll? Employees start to not show up after the first missed payroll. What are your alternate processing capabilities to keep people paid? How are you going to keep serving people that are requiring very difficult and complicated procedures without having access to medical records or what's happened in the past in their situation? And speaking to the dwell time, so how long it takes on average from a ransomware begin to encryption and demands That's averaging 9 days at this point. So David, what you were saying spot on, the short duration of ransomware actors is much different than the traditional breach of information security. They're acting very, very swiftly. They're getting access to systems, and they're trying to extort and disrupt an environment so that they can cash out as quickly as they can. And they're leaving a trail of disaster behind them because they're looking for your ability to recover, how they can disrupt that ability to recover so they can force you into a payment situation. So this is a slow motion disaster that they're causing for healthcare institutions. All right, this is also impacting leaders. So a recent study, 2021 by Cybereason, the true cost to business, 32% of organizations, and this isn't specific to healthcare, this is across all industries, 32% of organizations that went through ransomware, went through an encryption event and an extortion attempt, lost top leadership, either through dismissal or through resignation. What does that mean to your organization if you lose those people that you depend on to guide your organization and the decisions that you're making and your future, your strategy, and how you're implementing that strategy? What does that mean when you experience that level of disruption as a result of going through something that is in most cases preventable? 25% of businesses forced a period of closure because they couldn't get access to any IT systems. There was no use in some people showing up, so they closed their business for a period of time. And 29%, when we start looking at the cost of recovery and the cost of payment for ransomware, 29% were forced to eliminate jobs, most likely because this was an unplanned expense. And what happens to businesses when there is a $250,000 unplanned expense? Well, those growth plans, the hiring plans, you move into survival mode. You're no longer into succeed and growth mode. You're into survival mode. And a lot of times that forces the cut of jobs, trimming down the workforce in order to survive as a company. These are real impacts that are affecting our communities. This is friends and neighbors. This is everybody around us. When something like this goes on for a key institution, a building block of a community like a health system, this is affecting everybody in the community when this happens. And when this goes on, we don't get to just hide it. We don't get to just not tell anybody when this is going on. We just recently, within the last month, found out a guilty verdict on the former Uber chief information security officer because he lied about what happened with a data breach. Now this is case law. This is something that can be referenced for all of us as security leaders or all of us as leaders within organization. There's now criminal liability associated with lying and trying to cover something up. So we got to honor breach notification laws. We got to make sure that we're alerting our regulatory contacts that are required to know when something like this is going on. We got to have a plan. We don't get to just make it up as we go along. We have to have a plan. And then one of the other things that we're seeing our clients ask us for is cybersecurity insurance renewals. As I had the opportunity, so I joined Eide Bailly in May of this year. I had the opportunity to meet with 40-ish chief information security officers or business leaders in the upper Midwest in my last job, just talking through cybersecurity insurance and what they were seeing. And this encompassed healthcare, this encompassed manufacturing and agricultural and finance and a very good cross-section of all industries. What I was hearing, just to make sure I was level setting what we were experiencing at my last organization, was rates doubled and coverage is halved. So less coverage for more money. This is something that's going to be pervasive across healthcare, across everybody. When we start talking about this, looking back about 6 years ago, most organizations, or a lot of organizations, I won't say most, a lot of organizations cybersecurity insurance was their cybersecurity program. They didn't invest in controls and in security and how they protect their organization. They were looking at how they recover and are made whole if something bad occurs. And so cybersecurity filled that hole from a risk management technique for them. Now that cybersecurity insurance providers have been forced into losses due to having to pay out and make clients whole, those days of easy cybersecurity insurance renewals are over. The easy getting your policy in the first place is over. They're now looking at what are your cybersecurity program that you have in place? How are you auditing it? How are you ensuring that your controls that you think are in place are actually in place? And to get your renewal, you got to meet these 5 requirements, the orange items, just to have that conversation about getting your policy in the first place. Then you look into the recommended, and then all of your other cybersecurity and information security controls you have in place, and your audit program and everything else. We just worked with a fairly large health system that did not have something like multi-factor authentication and was missing some of the pieces around protecting backups, and they had a coverage gap. And so we're talking about hundreds of employees and thousands of patients that they are taking care of, and they had a 3-month coverage gap until they could implement some of these required controls and get their policy reinstated. They had an existing policy, and then suddenly they didn't get their renewal. So this stuff is real, and it's not just affecting this hypothetically. This is actually affecting people, and it's also affecting people that we work with. So we have firsthand knowledge of what's going on here. Another trend that we're seeing, and so this is going back to last year, this hit the news pretty hard, SolarWinds. So SolarWinds is IT software that your IT department is using to monitor your rest of your technology that you have in place, to know when something breaks or when there's downtime, so that they can respond even if something happens in the middle of the night. This is checking all the things to make all the things continue to run. And so SolarWinds got compromised, and its update mechanism for its software was abused by malicious adversaries in order to install malicious code across hundreds of organizations. Now, these are primarily government type entities, but this same situation can occur to all of us. So what are we going to do to ensure that those partners and that those IT providers and those other services that we are subscribing to and partnered with are doing good practices from a cybersecurity perspective? How are you going to audit and ensure that your vendor management program is doing what you expect to do to manage that risk appropriately? And then what IT controls do you have in place if a vendor becomes compromised, so that you can limit the scope of the breach and also understand what the impact is, and know that there is a change in behavior from that vendor that should cause an investigation? How are you monitoring for this? To call this out, this isn't magic. This isn't just jump to stealing everything. This isn't just jumping to getting all your money. This isn't just jumping to encrypting all of your stuff and then ransoming you for access to it. We know, based on previous events that have occurred, that malicious actors are doing certain things to get in your environment. And speaking to the whole, it isn't just jump to the end. They have to do certain things that in order to get to the end. They have to get malicious code on an endpoint or find an ability to remotely log into a system. They have to be able to establish persistence. They have to be able to survive a reboot in your environment. They have to be able to elevate privileges. They have to be able to evade whatever controls you have in place. They have to be able to move and find other systems in your environment. And they have to be able to remote control all those compromised assets from somewhere else over the internet, because they're most likely not local and on your network physically. they have to do all these things before they can get to that data exfiltration or that ransomware activity. And this gives us as defenders the opportunity to be catching them. We don't have to be good at every single step throughout this attack chain. We have to be good enough at various steps throughout the way to give us and our corporate board or our leadership confidence that we are able to defend ourselves. And this may not be internal IT, this may be people that we're hiring to do IT on our behalf, but we need to have somebody watching the right things. So what are we doing around watching for security in an organization?
So one of the things that we can do as an organization within internal audit groups or within IT departments is understand the logical access paths to where we do our business processes. There's internet security, there's network security, there's operation security, there's database security and applications. Each specific layer of our IT infrastructure has an access path. Who has access to this? What type of access do they have? As Kyle was, describing in that previous slide, that the steps that a breach can take follows a very distinct process, and it goes through each one of these layers. The more you understand where your data is, who has access to your data, whether that's internal users, external users, what that data is, and what do they have access to, the better you are as an organization to help defend something, some sort of attack. Any other things you want to add to that, Kyle? Good.
No, I think you covered it well.
Excellent. So again, the access to underlying operating systems, we need to test it because when you're within that information system, everybody that has elevated access rights can perform administrative functions. They have access to configuration, they have access to your data, they have access to your logs. They can change any of that. They can elevate privileges. They can stop and start a database. They can get to your different utilities and change the way that they work. This is all built into specific types of malware that is already out there. This is already built into ransomware that's out there. And then there are also the specific individuals that have the tools and the techniques to do this on their own. So again, it all comes down to the access. Who has the access? Where is it? And know your administrators and make sure there's a lockdown.
I think this is also a complementary process as well. So when we talk about how do we ensure all these things, first of all, we need to review the program from an IT audit perspective and look against known good practices. But then we also need to do the technical validation with things like vulnerability assessments and internal penetration tests. And by internal penetration tests, just to expand that on that a little bit, we want to look at how we're doing adversarial simulation. How are we creating that situation where there's a sparring match between the people protecting it and the people attacking it, so that we can not only identify the weaknesses, but also use that to identify if there's improvements needed to those that are being tasked with protecting that data. You don't know what's going to happen until you've practiced for the fight. You wouldn't just step in a boxing ring without having gone through sparring matches. All of those practice sessions allow you to be a more capable defender and understand if there are gaps that are identified above and beyond going through that program validation with IT audit.
Again, this is just a more visual layer of how everything within your information systems are touching. So we've got our external users, we've got database administrators who have access to applications in our database. We have systems administrators that have access to our operating systems. This really is a holistic view of our data, and you need to understand, again, I can't hammer this into each one of you enough, that you need to understand who these administrators are, what accesses do they have, and what access other than administrators within each one of these layers. Again, we all live within an integrated and technology environment. We have multiple areas within our organizations: finance, procurement, productions, logistics, planning, and other departments that have access to specific data. As you're understanding where that data is, we need to classify it. We need to know the risk levels of each types of those data and where they reside, because we may have specific healthcare data within multiple applications. Where is that data? Who has access to it, and how are we securing it? The more we know, the more we classify, and the more we map out our environment, the better we're going to be at potentially testing things and ensuring that access is administered appropriately and that our data has less opportunity to be compromised. I'm able to make it move. There we go. So what's a problem in our structure? If you look down to, how are we building our infrastructures? There's definitely the potential for inefficiencies within our data. If we don't have redundant systems, we could have wasteful spending. Do we have integrated systems? Are these systems talking to each other? The more that we build our infrastructure to help mitigate things on a security basis is only going to ensure that our analysis and the data that we can actually look at and protect is there. So one of the things that we always want to make sure is that when we're building things, we're removing legacy applications, we're really making sure that the structure not only is secure, but it's reliable and redundant. And so if we have those things in place, as we build out for the future, we want to make sure that that structure is there and it'll help protect the environment from a security standpoint. All right, information technology is key. As we've talked about this from the beginning of our program here is, we're collecting information, we're using it, we're storing at it. Again, IT crosses the entire section of our business. Information is everywhere. Everything that we do is dependent on information technology. We need to understand our data. We need to know where it's at. We need to know who has access to that data, and we need to test it. And so the more we know about our applications and our infrastructure, the better off we're going to be to protect it. One of the things that, as compliance professionals, we look at more of the risk side, where if we look at our operations side, they have specific IT objectives. Those are interrelated. So the purpose of this slide really was to, try to gain an understanding of, as an IT professional, we want to make sure that our information is efficient and our operations are successful. The IT risk side of that, if I'm looking at for my auditor hat, I just want to make sure that I don't lose that information. I want to make sure that we are logging everything appropriately. I want to make sure that we have specific controls. And so, the objectives of IT, a lot of times they want to run fast and lean. They don't want to have a lot of controls in place, but we have multiple risks that we need to mitigate as they related to IT. And so that was really the point of this, is that we need to try to make sure that as an IT organization, both from a compliance standpoint, from an audit standpoint, from an operational standpoint, we need to be in sync and understand why a lot of these compliance risks are being raised. And so, I think a lot of things that we've touched on within this previous to this help depict why.
So Waffle House, everyone else on this call has no idea why I included this slide here. But I think Waffle House is an excellent example of being prepared for disaster. So all throughout the South, this specific restaurant is known as the last place to close and the very first place to open in a disaster. And when I say disaster, tornadoes, hurricanes, large scale infrastructure disasters. And this restaurant is known so well for its ability to both survive the storm, weather the storm, and rebuild after the storm, that FEMA actually uses the Waffle House Index as a rating of how bad a storm is. So when we think about that, they have alternate processes for being able to cook without natural gas, without propane. They can operate their restaurant without ice. They can operate without power. They've planned, they know what's up. They actually have jump teams and RVs and people ready to swarm an area and get restaurants up and running as soon as it's safe after a storm has cleared. They have contractors that are pre-arranged if they suffer building damage. They know how to contact and get priority service through utilities. We should be talking about healthcare that same way. What are we doing in healthcare to come prepared for the storm of ransomware, of malware, of all these things that we know that are coming for us. How are we going to prepare? How are we going to be that same level of image when disaster strikes, being able to serve our community, being able to serve those people that need our help? If a restaurant serving waffles can do it, we should be able to do it taking care of people's health. This is a process. Along with IT audit, we also want to observe what is it going to take to get back up and running. Now I'm just going to skip over this. Here, we'll go to the next one. The savings of being prepared. What are you going to do when the disaster strikes? How are you going to be prepared for that? Whether it's a business continuity issue or it's responding to an incident, what have you gone through as far as tabletop testing? How have you created your plan? Do you have a marketing or communications person that's able to direct that flow of information to everybody external to your organization? Is that same person able to direct the flow of information internal to your organization so your employees get what they need when they need it? How are they going to do that when IT systems fail, either through a availability issue or through a ransomware or cybersecurity incident response type issue? Walking through these things and testing these with key stakeholders that know how to organize and what strings to pull within the organization to get everything back up and running. Being prepared has been proven time and time again to save money going through these disasters. This isn't foolish money spent. This is investing in your ability to survive. And on average, recent studies say you spend 40% less during a data breach if you're prepared, if you have a plan and you know what's up. When you're talking about a data breach and cybersecurity insurance, knowing who to call to start that line of recovery with your cybersecurity insurance carrier, they're going to involve people like a breach attorney so that you can start getting communications under client attorney privilege. They're going to have pre-negotiated contracts unless you've already done that with forensic and incident response people. Knowing what that flow looks like to get this situation under control, and then triage and understanding how you can get everything up and running as quickly and as efficiently as possible, making plans for when key individuals aren't available. If everything depends on one person, that's a plan for failure. We need to make sure that everybody that's going to be expected to step up in the disaster recovery phase, that they have access to that plan and they've been part of that practice so that we're not dependent on any one location, any one person, or any one specific piece of technology. We need to have a plan in order to ensure surviving an incident and looking the same from our business perspective.
All right, we'll wrap things up with a little overview of HiTrust. HiTrust came about quite a few years ago as a push to help formalize HIPAA, the HIPAA security and privacy rule. You know, this organization tried to make what is, if you look at the security and privacy rules, it's very gray. There aren't a lot of very specific items that you have to check the box. And so HiTrust came in to try to build a tool, an application, a compliance standard to help formalize this process. When it came about, they built it upon ISO 27001. And if you think of ISO 27001, it's a very holistic approach to information security. They want to make sure that you have everything documented appropriately. They want to make sure that you're identifying your risks. They want to make sure that you are auditing your program on a regular basis. They want to make sure that you're testing specific controls within your organization and linking those to the risks that you've identified. And so as a basis for this, it was a great place to start, because if you think of HiTrust as it's been implemented and presented throughout the last few years, it's not a pass-fail type of process. They understand that there are different levels of maturity throughout the process. IT isn't black and white, risk isn't black and white. And so they're looking at 5 different areas within your organization's maturity process. They're looking to see if you have policies written. Do you have procedures around those policies written? Are you complying and are you implementing the specific practices and controls that you have within your organization? Those are the 3 basic and bare bones basic items of HiTrust. And then if you are a more mature organization, they want to make sure that you're measuring that. Are you auditing these things on a regular basis? And if there are items that come out of your audits, how do you measure it? And then how do you manage it? And so it's the 5 key components of testing it. They've also, taken this bare bones HIPAA security and privacy rule and expanded upon it. They've thrown different related standards into play. They pulled PCI into play. They pulled in Medicare and state regulatory type of agencies. So you can really build a program that will help benefit your organization as you're dealing with multiple compliance related activities. And so it's ever changing. It's being updated on a real-time basis. They implement different iterations of their tool at least multiple times a year. So again, it's a standard that it's out there and it's being used by multiple health organizations. It's also being used by a lot of biotech. And then multiple organizations that are non-healthcare related are also utilizing it just to help manage their compliance structure, whether that be SOC 2, whether that be ISO 27001, whether that be NIST, or whether that be something along the lines of a PCI. And so it's been out there, it's been a while, it's fairly proven, and it's consistently being updated. If you think about the HiTrust actual how it's breaking down, we talk about, again, it's built on ISO 27001 to break it into specific control categories, and it really follows that ISO 27001 categorically related within the 14 different domains. We have specific objectives, and then within that there are controls that are identified for you to test as an organization. Again, I just wrote right down there, there are 149 specific controls, and then again, approximately 1,000 requirement statements spread over each implementation level. As you define your environment, it can grow and within complexity within their specific tool. I think the smallest number of compliance requirements that you would need to attest to for HiTrust is in the low 200s. And as we layer in PCI, as we layer in specific regulatory statutes, privacy statutes, you can get up to, building your control environment to well over 1,800 controls. And when you're testing it, these are the different domains that you're testing. Everything from standard information security program, endpoint protection, and everything down to our data protection and privacy. The things that Kyle and I have been talking about for the entire conversation is really encapsulated within this specific assessment. So it's something we're seeing more and more. So just wanted to add in some information for HiTrust if you had any questions about that. I'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, and anyone that has questions, you could put it in the chat, or more specifically, if you can raise your hand, I think, right, Amy, and ask a question live. We got a few minutes on that. And maybe
Yes.
while we're waiting, I do have a couple maybe questions for our 2 panelists here today. David, first of all, on HiTrust, where do we see the value? If you're out there and we get an audience and they're going, okay, what value do I get? Obviously, you have ability to kind of assess yourself against standards and where you are, but just thoughts on that.
So we see it from 2 different areas. I see partners of our business associates are required to do it. So you see it more of a, as they're partnering and trying to gain more business, their partners are demanding that they have a robust security environment. And one of the things that they want them to do is to get a HiTrust certification. The other way that I see it as a huge benefit to companies is that if you are trying to comply with multiple standards, especially as it relates to the healthcare area, you test once and you comply with multiple regulatory bodies. And so like I said, you can pull in state regulatory agencies, federal regulatory agencies, Medicare, C&D, Medicaid, state pharmaceutical type of compliance activities, it's all in the tool. And so if you're really trying to hone in everything that you're doing from an information security wise and comply with it and track it, that's one of the main benefactors or benefits of using the HiTrust CSF.
So from a cybersecurity perspective, Scott, I think there's a lot of advantages to basing it off of a framework like this, specifically with the focus of how do we reduce our attack surface and allow us to watch and protect less stuff better. And so we don't want to just go willy-nilly and just decide we need to focus on this or that or the other thing. We want to start with a comprehensive framework like the HiTrust framework, so that we can have a common sense way of tackling this problem. But again, maybe applying that approach of reducing our attack surface, so it allows us to continue to scale, maybe as our organization is growing or as we're having staffing challenges, because we all know that it's difficult finding the right individuals in this environment that we all live in right now, whether it would be from patient care all the way through IT. It's difficult finding that staff. And so allowing our staff to scale and focusing in on how do we protect less stuff better.
Well, that's helpful, and I none of us are, the three of us are attorneys, but I would think that to the extent you've utilized the framework to assess yourself against, and you've done it diligently, to the extent you had an attack, and obviously, as you mentioned earlier, you must report that appropriately to the public. That may reduce exposure. At least you've got a story to tell as to what you have done. And it still happened, because in this ever-changing environments, it's probably difficult to completely foolproof yourself against any type of cyber attack. So,
yep, and as we talk about that, nothing's ever 100% like what you just mentioned, but as you add layers and build in your protections throughout that attack chain, again, relying on that framework that we just talked about, because it's a great spot to start. Looking at that attack chain, having enough detections and protections and things that you're doing throughout that attack chain. You don't have to be perfect everywhere. You just have to be pretty good in enough spots to catch a cycle of an attack while it's still an incident, rather than at the disaster phase. Because incidents we don't have to report, incidents we can deal with, incidents we can recover from very easily. Breaches, data loss, ransomware, that disaster is much harder to recover from.
Good, thank you. One other follow-up question, as we got a couple minutes here, and this is backtracking a little bit. Both of you somewhat touched on it, and it was related to ransomware, but maybe it's malware. 3 or 4, key things that you see as important from the standpoint of mitigating these type of attacks, or processes or controls that need to be in place. And then maybe along those lines, and I've heard you speak before, Kyle, and maybe because I'm not a technology person, I always think, boy, we're backing up our data, so we have a plan because our data is backed up, but that isn't foolproof either, and there's issues with what you do and how you do it. Maybe talk a little bit more specifically about that. I know that was kind of embedded in some of the earlier slides, but.
Yeah, so David, I'll jump in here first. When I think of maybe the top 3 controls, let's call it top 3. MFA, there's a reason why multi-factor authentication is on the list of what insurance carriers are looking for. They know that that's one of the primary controls that stops them from having to pay claims and keep them in business. So MFA everywhere, but we want to implement things like MFA, again, going back to that control structure, in a way that benefits the entire organization. So as we require MFA and increase our overall cybersecurity posture, we're doing it in a way that reduces friction for the organization. We don't want to implement 14 or 15 different MFA solutions or multi-factor authentication solutions for every individual application. We need to do it in a holistic manner where we can, so that we can have one solution that allows us to make certain decisions based on where you're coming from, whether it's a trusted device or not a trusted device, if it's from a location where I've been from in the past, if it's during normal work hours. If I've met other conditions, maybe I don't need a prompt for multi-factor challenge response type information if I can satisfy some prerequisites. Again, lowering that friction for increasing the level of security. The other controls that we're looking at is EDR, that next-gen antivirus. Who's watching your security infrastructure, and are they paying attention? We need to make sure that we're monitoring at the endpoints and across the network, and doing in such a way that, again, we're catching these events as incidents, as just an execution or as a minor flaw rather than disaster. And then going to your backup comment, Scott, I think that's extremely relevant. So the old way of doing tape backups and keeping things offline, that was great. You can't compromise something that's not plugged in. That's not the reality for nearly every organization out there right now. So the new name for something like that, but in a digital world, is an immutable backup. So that one-way valve, if you to call it that, that allows you to do the backup, but then know once you've made it, it can't be modified or deleted, because these ransomware and malware operators are looking at disrupting your backup system so that they force you into paying them for a recovery type situation. So we want to make sure you're protecting it, and then that you're testing your backups, because just because you're backing up to a cloud provider doesn't mean that you can download and recover from that cloud provider in the time that the business needs to be able to get everything back up and running. So we need to make sure that we're doing things like cached local backups and testing downloads from our cloud backup provider to understand what our true recovery time is, to make it match what the business expects.
Good, thank you. David, any other thoughts? Or?
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. So that you see more and more often, right? You always think I can recover from my backup because I'm backing up. And if that backup is not physically segregated or logically separated, it's no good. You know, it can be corrupted. It can, the entire infrastructure, including your backup, can render you irreparable. So he was right on the money.
Good. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Amy, I don't think we have any other questions out in the chat or anywhere else, but if anyone else wants to raise their hand or anything, we got a minute or two. Again, just a reminder, this is in your information of the next two in the webinar series. We appreciate everyone attending. Obviously, in the healthcare world, we're going through a lot of things. A lot of those put pressure on everyone to do their job faster, quicker, more efficiently because of resource demands, and that creates risk. So certainly keep that in mind. To the extent you want to reach out to any of us, there's the contact information here, and certainly I think all of us would welcome touching base with anyone if they have any follow-up questions. So with that, I think we're wrapped up a couple of minutes early, Amy, and I'll let you wrap it up.